This next panel, entitled System of a Downturn, the Relationship Between Capitalism and Recession, is going to be chaired by Dr. Hans Ehrbar, who's an associate professor from the University of Utah. He received a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. He's done work with Marx, open source software, and has spent much of his recent time working on climate change and environmental justice. And also Gregory Lucero is a founding member of the Revolutionary Students Union, a UU philosophy grad, who is working on a union apprenticeship with IATSE Local 99 and a Master's of Business Administration. So let's give him a hand.
So, is that working? Okay, a little bit. So I'll go first so I can keep my remarks brief, so Dr. Ehrbar can wrap it up. The question of the recession, I just want to cover a few empirical points about this most recent recession and tie them to the theoretical analysis of capitalism and the ongoing trends. So through this methodological analysis, we can sort of begin to understand a little bit of the structure of capitalism. So understanding this recession, this current recession, requires that we understand essentially default credit swaps. If you talk to most economists, if you even read the paper frequently, certainly you've heard default credit swaps. The basic understanding of a default credit swap is that you create a financial instrument which then insures a financial transaction or insures a sort of another financial instrument. So what happened with this most recent downturn is there were a lot of financial instruments insuring mortgages. There's been a huge upsurge in housing, and that housing needs people to get mortgages on it. And so there was a great deal of there were many mortgages offered to basically everyone. If you've seen any of the commercials of nothing down, you can move into your own home, why rent, etc., etc. All of those were part of this sort of housing bubble. Well, what happened is all these mortgages were bought, and they packaged mortgages together. So instead of just having your mortgage that is owed to a bank or a financial institution, basically all of these mortgages were bundled together and bought as a single lump sum. Well, there's not necessarily any problems on its surface with that, except that these mortgages were being offered to people who couldn't afford them. And in the logic of capitalism, the idea was we'll offer a loan to people who can't afford it, and then when they can't afford the loan, then we'll foreclose on them, and we'll not only get the money from the loan, we'll also get the house to resell. So this is doubly good for us. And of course, you've probably heard adjustable rate mortgage, an ARM, which is basically where your loan is for a certain period of time, and after that certain period of time, it adjusts, never down, always up, to an incredibly high rate. So the interest would go from 4 or 5% to 10 to 20%. So what would happen is people could make the payments on a 4 or 5% interest loan, but when it jumped to 10 to 20%, they couldn't even pay off the interest of the loan. They couldn't pay the rate of the loan. And of course, again, the banks thought this is a great idea because we'll foreclose on the house, we'll have the money from the loan, and then we'll also have the house that we can resell or rent out or what have you. Well, as John Maynard Keynes said, he's dead now, if you owe the bank $1,000, you have a big problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank has a big problem. And this is exactly what happened. Numerous people were unable to pay their loans and were thus forced into foreclosure and bankruptcy. Sure, the banks got the houses, but there was no ability to resell them because everyone who could afford a house had already bought a house and had been thrown out through their adjustable rate mortgages and the extremely high cost of these loans. Well, this brings us back to the default credit swaps. At this point, the financial instrument is not that one person has defaulted on their loan, but because they were securitized, because they were given a sort of insurance, all these loans were bundled together. So if one person defaulted, that's a problem. If 100, if 1,000, if 1,000,000 people, default on their loans, that's a huge problem. Well, the problem is this triggered a crisis because everyone had these default credit swaps on housing. And suddenly, and again, it's an insurance, essentially an insurance policy, it's a fiscal tool. Suddenly all these debts became due and no one could afford them. And so we saw a wide collapse across our economy. Of all of the 5 major investment firms, only Goldman Sachs, I believe, is still standing out of like 6 or 7 financial institutions that had trafficked in millions and billions of dollars. Only one remained standing because it was the only one that wasn't tied out to these default credit swaps. Now, the cautionary tale might be, well, we should avoid default credit swaps, but there's a deeper story about capitalism. And that story is the drive for profit. We have noticed in the last 20 years since the deregulation of the economy from Glass-Steagall, an ongoing liberalization of especially financial markets. Capitalism is a system based on profit motive. And so there is an ongoing drive to create more and more profit, to make more and more money. However, the simple fact of the matter is the system can't hold itself. The money has to come from somewhere. It can't be conjured out of nothing. And so by and large, it comes from working class people. But there's a certain point in which you can't bleed any more blood from a stone. There's a certain point in which working class people can't continue to prop up the system. And that's what we're noticing in this recession. The banks, the financial institutions, they can no longer drain money from the creditors who have taken out these loans. And so we're in a liquidity crisis, which is to say there's not enough money flowing around the entire system. And this is actually the natural order of capitalism, to push for more and more money due to the competitive market, due to the need for profit, such that the demand for profit becomes so great that whatever is giving that profit, whether it's grain and the agricultural surplus of the Great Depression, whether it's slavery in the 19th century, the center can't hold. And this is the nature of capitalism. It pushed development and profit in housing to the point where no one can support it. No one can afford their loans. No one can afford to pay the exorbitant rates of banks. This precipitated a crisis that capitalism is always creating. A search for profit is always going to bring more crisis. So the recession that we're in, this downturn that we're facing, while certainly significant and greater than the most recent downturns we've seen in the mid-90s and the 80s, is nothing more than the normal functioning of capitalism. So I'll just be brief on my next point. But this is also the nature of capitalism, is to search for bailouts. And the bailouts may come in different forms. It may come in the form of a war, it may come in the form as a tax credit for either housing or automobiles. But capitalism is a political economy. So we can talk about the economy, we can talk about the default credit swaps, we can talk about the adjustable rate mortgages, but there is always a political aspect. And a political aspect much greater than simple deregulation, which allowed for this to occur. You'll notice that when the car companies were going under, harsh austerity measures were forced on them. Unions were forced to buy more stock in the company, wages were cut, retirement was cut, benefits were cut. But when the investment firms and the banks were having trouble, there was $80 trillion immediately freed up from both parties in order to restore liquidity. And of course, you can look at Greece, right? There was money for a bailout, but not money for social services. This is the political aspect of political economy. We are constantly facing the crises of capitalism, but because we live in a capitalist political economy, they control the political apparatus, they control the state, they control the government. And because they do, they are able to institute bailouts. They are able to institute a financial policy that is the government spending money that benefits them over everyone else. So these two components, the ongoing creation of crises by capitalism and their inevitable search for bailouts, which is to say governmental intervention into the very downturns that capitalism has created, are not new. They are not unique. The Tea Party is completely wrong to say that this is a new era of big government. From Theodore Roosevelt to Barack Obama, we can expect a government intervention into the economy because our political economy is a capitalist political economy. Because in a capitalist economy, the politics and the economy themselves are geared to the benefit of the capitalists, not to the average worker, not to the consumer, not even towards a sane financial policy that will increase growth as gross domestic product. Currently, if I remember my statistics correctly, we are looking at a 50% idle rate in industry. We are looking at a 50% capacity in industry, which means the amount of work that firms are doing, companies are doing today, literally they could expand that, double that, and yet they're not because of a problem of demand. Workers do not have enough money to buy the products offered. Just as in housing, plenty of people want houses, but they cannot afford the cost of their mortgages. And so this downturn should not be seen as a unique situation. Neither this downturn nor the Great Depression or any other crisis should be understood as an exception to capitalism, but rather the ongoing everyday function and normalization of capitalist demand and capitalist profit. And so, again, with this downturn, what I want to stress is the drive for profit in the financial sector, in the banks, in the loan industry, has driven us to a catastrophe. But to simply say that is to ignore the systemic problems that will forever return us into a quotidian cycle of the ever same. And so I've already talked too much. Let me hand it over to Dr. Ehrbar.
Okay, there are two ideas which are kind of in my head and which help me understand what is going on, and I don't claim that I understand it all, but I think I want to put those ideas out because I think they are ideas worth knowing anyway, and they may be helpful for you too. The one idea comes from statistics. I have been teaching econometrics and statistics for many years, and one of the things which I'm telling my students is the Cauchy distribution. The Cauchy distribution is what's called a fat-tailed distribution. So it's not, normally we look we assume things are normally distributed or something which becomes normal when you take averages over it, and the normal distribution has very thin tails. So extreme events are extremely rare. They practically don't happen. A thick-tailed distribution is such that extreme events can happen. They don't happen very often, but you can get extremely extreme events. And with a normal distribution, it just would never happen. It would happen in billions of years or something like that. But with a fat-tailed distribution, this can happen next year. And one of the things about those fat-tailed distributions, like the Cauchy distributions, is very unintuitive. If you take the average of two Cauchy distributions, it has the average of two has exactly the same distribution as each of them individually. And I'm saying this is unintuitive because we are used to the idea if we observe something, there is a signal in there and there is noise, and one way to filter out the noise and find out what the signal is of a noisy time series is taking the average, then the noise cancels itself out, and what remains is the signal. And the more observations you have, the better knowledge you have where the mean of the distribution is, where the signal is, as opposed to the noise. And if the reality, that's true for a reality which is based on thin-tailed distributions, but if you have a reality based on thick-tailed distributions, then this doesn't hold. Then if you take the average of your observations, they are just as much all over the place as each observation itself. And one of the ways to think about it is if you have two Cauchy distributions, then they have this potential to generate a huge outlier. So now you have 2 times this potential to generate a huge outlier. So averaging them out doesn't help because the whole thing can be jolted by a huge outlier. So why am I telling you about Cauchy distributions? The first time I kind of got acquainted with them was there's an economist by the name of Phil Mirovsky who wrote a paper which said, assume that the reality is not normally distributed, but it has thick tails, then everything which we are doing in econometrics is just is worthless. Because you cannot find through the econometric means what's really going on. Each econometric estimation result has as much information as just one data point, and we cannot. So it's incredibly misleading, and the thing with the default credit swaps is the following. In the last 20 or so years, some of the most desirable jobs were in finance. Some of the most intelligent people went into finance departments. Some of the best mathematicians went into finance departments because in finance they could compute those surefire portfolios which where all the risk was kind of cancelled out, and you were sure, or almost sure, to get big rates of return on your investment. And these are those hedge funds, and you need a degree in statistics and in finance in order to design those hedge funds. And there were some Nobel laureates in economics were making a killing on getting really rich on those hedge funds. Now, the problem with those with this whole calculation which those hedge funds were making is that they assumed thin tail distributions. If you assume thick-tailed distributions, then all this goes out of the window. And I think this is what happened with the collapse in 2008. That this collapse was something which took all the finance experts by surprise, because they thought they had calculated the risk of those securities, and their result was this collapse would have been a 1 in 1,000-year event, but the collapse happened right then, and they just used the wrong mathematics, and basically they were the victims of the ideology that you can create value by removing risk. And that's what they thought they were doing. They were combining assets in such a way that the risk was canceling itself out, and the combined asset had a higher value than the individual assets, and they pocketed the difference. And but they thought, well, we're getting reward for it, that we remove risk, or we give risk to those who want to bear risk, and take it away from those who don't want risk. And so this whole thing, went up in flames, and people were very surprised that this happened. And one of the things is they thought, they used the wrong. They used the wrong mathematics, although they were math wizards, and they had the wrong conception about where value comes from. We as Marxists know value comes from the labor of workers, and if you take a course in mainstream economics or in finance, then value comes from many things. For instance, if you repackage risk, you can create value. And where does it come from? They don't really ask this question, because value is something real, and how can you create real wealth by just accounting tricks, basically? So we Marxists are not surprised, but they were kind of the victims of their own ideology, and the idea of thick-tailed distributions, where the thin-tailed distribution was a big factor in this. This idea of thick-tailed distributions versus thin-tailed distributions is also an issue in terms of global warming. That the events which we have in which we foresee in global warming, there can be extreme events, and those extreme events are not extremely unlikely, but they are likely. They can happen. And therefore, all the cost-benefit analysis, which mainstream economists do with respect to future risk of global warming, are completely misleading again, because they use the wrong the wrong framework here. So this is so the 2008 bubble was a mistake. So I would kind of disagree with you in the sense of saying that this is just normal capitalism. I think things are. It was not normal capitalism. There were several things coming together, and one of them was this. The attempt to use the wrong math to master reality. Another thing which I want to bring up is, which is kind of an unrelated thought, which is also kind of a simple thought, which I think helps understand the events, is the issue of seniority. Which means the creation of purchasing power, of new purchasing power. We live in a commodity society, so the principle of commodity societies is you cannot spend money before you have earned money. You have to sell something first, and then after you have sold that, after you have found someone who needs your product, then you have that money, and that money gives you the right now to choose from the products of the sellers, and in this way you pass it on to the next person by giving him or her the permission to buy something, because they produce something which is needed by someone, namely by me. So it is the principle that you cannot buy before you have sold. Now this principle is not compatible with an expanding economy. Because if this production period is selling so many goods, and next production period selling 2% more, then those extra 2% cannot be bought from the sale coming from this production period. So if you are in a growing economy, there's always the need to create purchasing power in the sense of some people are allowed to buy before they have sold. Otherwise, the whole thing, the market economy, collapses. Now, let's think about it, how this new purchasing power was created during the time of what they are often called the golden age of capitalism, which is the decades after World War II in the 50s and 60s. There you had banks giving loans to businesses who are basically the loan officer in a town was one of the most important persons. He knew everyone. Businesses came to him and said, I have this proposal, I want to make a business, and the loan officer could make a judgment about it, whether this was a sound business or not, and gave loans to those people who had sound business proposals. And in this way, and by giving loans, a bank can create purchasing power. And this purchasing power was given to promising businesses because in the judgment of the people who know the economy really well, these businesses would be able to succeed and would contribute to the growth. That was in the olden days, and that was before the word securitization. Now we are no longer bothered with loan officers making those in-person inspections. Now everything is done by the markets, and this leads to it that the generation of new purchasing power is still an issue, but it's no longer controlled by the local banks, and it's somewhere else. And there was a proposal by John Maynard Keynes for the Bretton Woods international finance system. He wanted to have a currency, the bancor, which was where this seniority was controlled, and it was basically given to those countries which are most in need. So that if we have an expanding economy, and if there is someone who should be able to be allowed to purchase before they can sell something, then this should be a developing country which needs to build up infrastructure, because that allows them to build up a productive economy. And in this way, that would be kind of a rational capitalistic way of dealing with new purchasing power. These efforts by John Maynard Keynes and many similar efforts since then were fought tooth and nail by the United States, because the United States, they're using their own currency as world currency. So the whole seigniorage comes to the United States, which means that the richest country of the world gets a free ride and gets to print money to buy real goods from other countries, rather than giving this to the poorest countries. And we are using it to finance our wars, we are using it to finance our stock market bubbles, and things like that. And so the issue, why is it so easy to make money in the United States and much harder to make money in any other country, is exactly that our businesses are really greased up by the fact that we can create demand out of nothing. We don't have to worry about our balance of payment. That is other people's problems, and therefore we can we are unconstrained, and this leads to this has led at the beginning, this was a situation which was realistic, or which fit together with reality, because right after World War II, the United States had this seigniorage, but the United States also was the country with the highest technology, and was the one industrial country which emerged from World War II unscathed, with all their industrial capability intact. So they were economically the giant behind, which allowed them to print dollars, because everyone else who needed certain things, they had to come to the United States to buy them. For instance, it was not possible to buy airplanes. You had to go to Boeing or McDonnell, some of the American firms to buy airplanes. You could not get them, at that time, you could not get them basically anywhere else. And so they were the leaders. But now, over time, other countries have risen up, and the United States is no longer the economic superpower which it used to be, but it still has the dollar as a world reserve currency, and but the dollar is on very shallow grounds. And now, what does that have to do with the crisis? See, in my thinking, and in the thinking of many other economists, for instance, Hyman Minsky, who is kind of ultra-Keynesian, who is has done work about financial stability, crises like the Great Depression in the 30s, or something which happened now in 2008, they are a necessary part of the system, and they have a cleaning function, because they remove the overhang of credit. So those crises mean that lots of people who are the creditors losing money, and the people who are debtors are gaining money. But the debtors are usually the productive capitalists, and the creditors are basically the parasites on the system. So it's good to clean out those parasites, and that's what happened in the 30s. Those banks, those creditors went bankrupt, and the productive industry was freed from those ownership claims, and they could build new. And then over time, more and more ownership claims came again, in the 50s and 60s. American firms were not indebted at all. They had financed their expansions by just retained earnings. And then in the 60s and 70s and 80s, more and more outside financing came in, and now every firm is basically under a big weight of, because there are lots of people having creditor claims on the product of those firms. And a crisis, when those creditors are nice enough to go out of business, then we should just let them go out of business and say good riddance, because that's good for the economy if we get rid of this credit overhang. And why could the United States not do this? But basically, what has been done since 2008 with the bailouts, they tried to prolong the credit overhang and try to prevent it from collapsing. Why did they not do it if their own economists say that this would be a good thing? And nobody is talking about it, but I think the reason is that they could not do it because if they would have done this, they would have really pissed off the Chinese who are holding most of the credit for the United States. And the Chinese said, you cannot do this for us. If you do this, then this is war, then this is economic war, then we will no longer finance you. And the dollar would have collapsed. And these are the geopolitical implications which force the United States to do the wrong thing and just hobble on with this credit overhang and pamper the parasites in our economy, because we cannot get rid of them. Because our country is already, due to the dollar is already, the time of the dollar is over, and everyone is afraid what is coming after the dollar. Right now, the Chinese are financing us, which is unprecedented, that a superpower of the world is financed by, to such an extent, by someone who is a potential competitor. And so things are very complicated, but we are in a situation in which not only capitalism is a bad system, but the American hegemony is about to fade away, and the way it fades away makes this world a very dangerous place. It's like a tiger cornered in a corner, who can become very violent, and the United States has lots of weapons and stuff like that. So these are, it's not only that capitalism is bad, and I used to say to my students, there's no doubt capitalism is very resilient. It will continue to exist, but there is the hegemonial position of the United States in the capitalist system is not assured. Capitalism will continue even after the United States is no longer a hegemon, but has become a sweatshop, basically. And we are right on the way towards doing this. And we are witnessing the disintegration of the hegemonial power of the capitalist system. And there are no right answers as far as the ruling class is concerned. There are, of course, right answers as far as the working class is concerned, but the ruling class, they are just tumbling from one crisis to the next.
So are there any questions?
Well, just a comment. I can only think of one hegemonic power that voluntarily simplified itself in order to survive, and that was the Byzantine Empire. Every other complex society that has been forced into simplification has done so because there was no other way, because it was compelled by force of circumstance to become remarkably simple. It doesn't strike me that the United States has the political capability to do what the Byzantines did after the Crusade invasions of the 12th century. It doesn't seem to me that the United States will do that, precisely because of the factor you raise, and that is the cornered tiger phenomenon. And we see that politically now with the rise of a movement in the United States that is doctrinally committed to the notion of maintaining United States supremacy at all costs. And that does give us pause, I think, and make us reflect on the dangers inherent in the simplification process once it becomes apparent that there is no other course of action available to the United States. What will it do?
Well, in this case, I would certainly agree that the United States is a tiger. However, given my political predilections, I would also say it's a paper tiger. Which is not to say that it can't do a great deal of destruction. I mean, we're seeing this clearly and obviously in Libya, where Gaddafi, by no means a strong opponent to American hegemony, but simply refused to fall in line, has become target of, bombings. All of this on the basis of a crisis in which we can't afford to pay school teachers, we can't afford to, pay Social Security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But while certainly the United States can lash out, and it has, and it will continue to do so, the effectiveness of those actions is minimal. Three really quick examples. First is Afghanistan, right? There was a geopolitical attack on Afghanistan, not really in any substantive sense predicated by 9/11, but just an attempt to restore American hegemony and American supremacy on a nation that really had very little to do with the attack, which had very little to lose by invasion, which was subject to attack and invasion. And the United States still cannot accomplish its stated geopolitical objectives in Afghanistan, even with the help of NATO. The second, of course, is Iraq. The United States can't really and has not accomplished any of its stated geopolitical objectives in Iraq. And again, we're talking about two of the most poverty-stricken nations. Afghanistan had the highest infant mortality rate. It's been a desolate war zone for the last 20 years since the United States financed the Islamicist fight against the socialist Soviet Union. And Iraq has been under sanctions for 10 years and constant bombardment through the so-called no-fly zone. And the United States still can't achieve its geopolitical objectives. Both of these are obviously combat and military oriented. But the other thing is the Chinese. If any of you have a long enough memory, you can remember the screaming and yelling and crying that the United States did in regards to China, especially the Chinese currency. They said the yuan which is the Chinese currency, is undervalued. And so that makes China more competitive on the world productive stage than other nations that have comparable productive forces. And they demanded that China reevaluate their currency because the yuan is pegged to the dollar, which is to say it's connected to the dollar so that China can easily sell its products to the United States. And that fight for China to reevaluate its currency, and certainly China is taking a look at it, there's other pressures and they're considering it, or working in some backdoor fashions to ease that, basically refused. And the United States was unable in any way, shape, or form to force the Chinese to reevaluate their currency. And in the very process of them denouncing the Chinese, we had this massive debt crisis, financial crisis, in which suddenly, almost immediately, almost overnight, the tables were turned And it was the Chinese demanding that the United States get its debt under control. And we currently hear neither hide nor hair out of some, besides, of course, some right-wing talk shows, about the Chinese currency. So certainly the United States has weapons, it has political clout, it has economic clout. But even in its most basic objectives, it is unable to reach them in any substantive way. It's unable to cow its enemies in any substantive way. I mean, most recently, I think the last communique from Gaddafi was that NATO and all of its supporters are a bunch of scumbags. I mean, the United States can't even topple one weak African leader without huge incident. And so I think this is an indication that yes, the United States will lash out, and we should not underestimate the ability of the United States to lash out as a cornered tiger. But as I said earlier, certainly this crisis was precipitated by all sorts of individual factors that were all unique. They were all novel. But the overall trend of capitalism is towards crisis, even if every feature of any given crisis is unique. So too, the United States is a tiger in that it is able to carry out dangerous and violent attacks all over the globe. It is able to destabilize economies and regimes all over the globe as a real tiger. But we also should, as Dr. Ehrbar said, recognize that by no means is the American supremacy hegemonic, or necessarily, it's not a necessary supremacy. And we should also recognize that, as a matter of fact, while it may be a tiger, it is in fact a paper tiger.
Discussion?
Any other questions, comments? Yes, in the back.
As far as when we're talking about reasons for the recession, and another crisis which we may or may not be coming up upon is this idea of student loans. I'm wondering, Doctor, your perspective on that.
Student loans.
Which I think I've heard that more people in this country have student loan debt than they have credit card debt.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this. Just one thing. It is, in my mind, a sign of a decaying empire if they don't educate their youth anymore. And making schools unaffordable is like refusal of educating. We have benefited from that brain drain as long as the United States were still working or seemed to be working. Yeah, lots of intellectuals from all over the world came to us, but we are losing that edge too. We are no longer the main inventors. Other countries are doing that now, and China is formidable in how much they educate their people and how much they promote technology and how much they invent. So that's maybe people say after the housing bubble there may be other bubbles in the works. Maybe also student loan bubbles or credit card bubbles and stuff like that. Apparently what we see now is a sovereign debt bubble, that everyone flees into sovereign debt. That's why the dollar, despite its weakness, despite the structural weakness of the whole financial system, the dollar has a high exchange rate, because whenever this weakness manifests itself, then you have immediately the safe haven effect that everyone goes to the dollar because they think the dollar is the safest in this whole system. Although the dollar is the reason for, one of the reasons for those crises, the dollar itself does not get punished by the market for being the reason for those crises. It's one of those perverse effects of markets. And so I don't know enough about the student loans, but I feel with you. I think I know at the University of Utah they have increased tuition in several years in a row by 10, 20%, and there was not a peep from the students. And I think it's up to you to say something about about tuition increases. This is a real issue, and that's an issue which is not only your own interest, but you're speaking for the interest of the whole nation if you speak out for lower tuition and affordable and better education in this country.
If I may, I have actually looked at some of the emerging news stories from student debt, and there's numerous structural problems that will not go away. So there was a recent move by Obama and this administration, not as though they're in any sense special, to consolidate all student loans through the government. So if any of you have student loans or are getting student loans, you know that you have to apply for federal financial aid. There is no longer any individual banks that can offer you student loans as such. It's all consolidated through the government. So that's one feature. The second is, I believe it was under Clinton, that bankruptcy no longer removes student loans. So you can no longer get rid of student loans by declaring bankruptcy. So that's another structural feature. The third, which is not directly related to student loans, is the bad labor market in the United States. More and more people graduating with degrees cannot find jobs. And because they cannot find jobs that previously they had, in many cases in the 60s and 70s, you didn't even need a college degree. That was management track. All you needed was a high school diploma. But because people are unable to find jobs to cover their own living, let alone their student loans, we're coming very rapidly onto a crisis in which student loans will not be able to be repaid. They cannot be wiped away, as Dr. Ehrbar said, in a debt overhang. They're no longer tied to private financial institutions. And even if they were, American citizens or anyone cannot wipe them away through declaring bankruptcy. And they're now directly tied to the government. So you have financialization that cannot be removed, that is tied to the government. This, to me, and again, every capitalist crisis is unique in its features, but this certainly indicates, to me at least, a trend towards a systemic crisis, at least of American capitalism, if not world capitalism itself, the global system of capitalism. So those are my views on that particular issue.
Maybe just one remark about this. I think the centralization of all the student loans with the government is also an opportunity, because it's much easier to make a political movement which demands from the government to lighten the load of the student loans than go into many different private institutions who say, well, we cannot afford it. So there are two sides to every crisis, and you have to look also at the opportunities in those crises.
Moving the loans from private banks to the government was a good step. But the only progressive thing that Obama has done. What the banks were doing simply was having the government pay all the losses and pay the banks, and they would get their interest off it. So the government was giving us the loans, but they had to send it through these banks, which charged their enormous toll. So the banks have been removed from that toll, and now you get the loan directly from the government. It's a lot better, it's a lot easier for the U.S. taxpayer. I don't know if it works out any different for students.
Well, and I certainly agree with that. But when we're talking about the system of downturns that is capitalism, I of course agree with Dr. Ehrbar. Every crisis of capitalism presents an opportunity for organization, an opportunity for change, an opportunity for resistance. And certainly we're, in a very certain sense, better off now that the private financial institutions like banks cannot charge on what essentially the government was paying anyway. Most financial institutions are parasitic on government anyway. But the key is, as a structural feature of capitalism, this is pushing us towards another crisis. Which is not to say we shouldn't use it in whatever ways that we can to build resistance, to build, I will just say personally for myself, to build revolution. But as a matter of fact, in analysis, we should recognize that tying these debts to the government and making it impossible to wipe them away through bankruptcy is a very dangerous and desperate move that very easily, especially given the labor market, especially given students' and workers' inability to pay back these loans, is almost certainly, and I will prognosticate on this, and you can all hold me to this, certainly going to lead to another financial crisis, one of which that will be as deep because it is directly tied to government and state institutions. That's, again, my view. Any other questions? I guess we should wrap this up then.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming out. And